Dzień dobry. Hello. In this presentation, I'm going to introduce you to history of Poland. It's over 1,000 years of turbulent and fascinating history. Let's first look at the outline of Polish history. So we can divide the history of Poland into several periods. The first one would be the reign of the Piast dynasty from 966 to 1370, almost 400 years when this dynasty was ruling Poland. The last king of this dynasty died without the legitimate male heir, and that's how this dynasty came to the end. And they're succeeded by the Jagiellonian dynasty, and the same end of this dynasty. Also, the last king of this dynasty died without the heir. But at that time, Poland was already ready to elect kings. And Poland entered what is called the period of elective kings, lasted from 1573, when Poland elected its first king, to 1795, when the last king, elected in 1764, abdicated. That was the end of what we call the First Republic of Poland, this abdication of the king Stanisław August Poniatowski. He was forced to abdicate after Poland was partitioned by three neighbors: Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Poland was partitioned, meaning it didn't exist as a state for, as you can see here, for 123 years. And that was a political will during the First World War and after the First World War to recreate Poland. And Poland was recreated in 1918, which is the year when the First World War ended. Existed till 1939, that the year where the Second World War started. And this period in Polish history is called the Second Republic. And then again, during the Second World War, Poland did not exist for almost 6 years. And after the Second World War, Poland became a communist state, and till 1989 was a communist state. In 1989, communism fell, and Poland entered the period in which we are now, which is called post-communist Poland. Now let's have a look at the map, which we have on the right. If you look at this map, you can see Poland during the first Piasts, and these are the borders. That is Poland around the year 1000. Then we have Poland at the end of Jagiellonian dynasty. Look how much bigger it is with today's Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. This was the Poland which was partitioned. When Poland was recreated in 1918, it's much smaller state. We have it here without these lands, which are contemporary Poland. And after the Second World War, when Polish frontiers were decided, Poland was moved more to the west, regained these territories in the west and in the north. If you look at the map of Poland, contemporary map of Poland, contemporary frontiers of Poland, and compare them with Polish frontiers around the year 1000, you see that they are very similar. Poland, for most of its history, was a monarchy. So a very important ceremony was coronation of the kings. And since 1320 till the very end of the First Republic, this sword called Szczerbiec was used for the coronation of the kings. Coronations happened at the Royal Wawel Castle, which was the residence of Polish monarch till the end of 1500s. Then residence and the capital of Poland was moved to Warsaw, but still Royal Wawel Castle was very important for dynasties ruling Poland and for elected kings, and that's where the coronations, most of them, took place. This is the view of the castle from the Wisła River. This is the courtyard. At the beginning of 1500s, there was a large fire in the castle, and the castle was rebuilt in the Renaissance style. It was the style which came to Poland from Italy. It is believed that Wawel Castle is a very special place. It's believed to be one of the energy centers in the world, of course, for some people who believe in chakras. There is a Wawel Hill, a Wawel Castle, and other buildings which are also located on the Wawel Hill. One of them, and also very important, is Wawel Cathedral. And that was the place where Polish monarchs were crowned. It is the coronation site. Also, it's the resting place of Polish kings. And in the crypts, which are located under the cathedral, there are tombs of the kings of Poland. Some of them are also buried inside the cathedral on the main floor. Not only the kings are buried in the crypts, there are also national heroes such as Kościuszko or Piłsudski, national bard Mickiewicz. Quite recently, in the year 2010, President Lech Kaczyński and his wife were buried there too. They died in the plane crash in 2010. They were on the plane with Polish officials which were going to Russia. There was a lot of conspiracy theories after that crash of that plane, which involves Russian involvement, but the plane, according to scientific evidence, crashed due to very poor weather conditions in Smolensk, where the plane was headed, and also technical problems with the plane itself. The burial was controversial because not everybody thought that the president should be buried there. As I mentioned, the first dynasty ruling Poland was Piast dynasty, ruled Poland for almost 400 years. And who you see on the right, it's the 19th century representation of Prince Mieszko I. We don't really know what he looked like. The most important event during his reign, the event which he was instrumental for, was Christianization of Poland. So in 966, Mieszko decided to adopt Christianity. Why did he do it? He did it because he was afraid that if he doesn't do it, then Germany would take over his lands, and Germany was Christian for already a few centuries. And during the medieval times, as you know, one of the goals of Christian knights was to convert pagans. Germans were involved in the Crusades, and Poles, for them, were pagans. So it was a good reason to invade Poland. When Mieszko adopted Christianity, it was a huge step for Poland. First of all, once he adopted Christianity, he had a chance to become a king. He didn't become a king, but his son, which we see in this slide, Bolesław the Brave, became the first king of Poland in 1025. This brought Poland into European political arena that prevented, to a certain extent, of course, German attacks on Poland, because Germany could not claim anymore that Poland was pagan. However, Poland was pretty much pagan for almost 300 more years. It took quite some time for people to convert. So it was very much political decision on the part of Mieszko. With Christianity, also Western civilization came to Poland. Western religious orders came to Poland, with them advanced ways in agriculture, Latin language, written language, and so on. Mieszko decided to adopt Christianity from Czechs because that was not threatening, like adopting Christianity from Germans. Then, as I mentioned, his son Bolesław the Brave became the first king of Poland in 1025. During his reign, Poland got its first saint, Saint Adalbert. But around year 1138, another king from this dynasty, Bolesław the Wrymouth, decided to divide his country between his sons. He wanted to do it because he wanted to avoid possibility of civil war. But it tells us that there had to be agreement in these different parts of Poland for that decentralization of the state. And that state of affair lasted for about 2 centuries, that Poland was divided into these provinces, which resulted in weakening the state. But in about 200 years, these provinces realized that they need a stronger central power. And Władysław Łokietek of Władysław the Short was able to reunite part of Polish land, not everything what was there in 1138. His son, Kazimierz Wielki, or Casimir the Great, Poles even today remember this king as a great builder. We have this saying in Polish about him that when he started his reign, Poland was built in wood. At the end of his reign, Poland was built in brick. Casimir the Great built towns, built churches, fortifications, and so on. He also established the very first university in Poland, in Kraków, the second after Prague, oldest university in that part of Europe. Why did he establish university? He established university because he needed skilled, trained administrators. He saw a need to invest in education. What greatly influenced Poland at that time were German settlers who were coming to Poland, started in 1200s. Why did they come to Poland? They came to Poland because Poland was underpopulated in comparison with Germany and offered them opportunities. Teutonic Knights. They were invited to Poland in 1226 by one of the princes, Prince of Mazovia. Teutonic Knights were the knights and monks, and they were established to defend the Holy Land, but they were established at the very end of the Crusades, so they needed the place to settle. First, they settled in today's Hungary, but they were not welcome there, and this Prince of Mazovia invited them to Polish land. He leased them a small piece of land, but very quickly they conquered neighboring Prussia and became Poland's enemy. And Poland, for centuries, fought Teutonic Knights. Another formidable enemy were Tatars and Mongols. In 1200s, they would raid southern parts of Poland, pillaging, looting, taking people hostage for ransom, taking children, male children, and then training them, and they would become warriors for Tatars. They were virtually unstoppable. Not only Poland, but other Western European countries were not able to defend themselves against the Tatars. Why? Because the style of waging the war was different than Western style. They were swift, they were light, they would attack the enemy, then change the direction of their movement very quickly. Heavy European knights were not able to do it. Not only Germans settled in Poland at that time, but also a lot of Jews came to Poland. They came to Poland when they were expelled in other European countries. Jews were encouraged to come to Poland by royal charters. They found Poland more hospitable than other European countries. And the first capital of Poland was Gniezno, which is near Poznań. Later on, the capital was moved to Kraków. Let's look at these maps, which show us Poland at the beginning of the Piast dynasty. That's Poland. Prussia is here. And this is Poland at the very end of the Piast rule during the reign of Casimir the Great, when his father reunified Polish territories. He was able to reunify only a part of them, which is Greater Poland and Lesser Poland. But his son expanded Polish territories, but look how Poland is expanding towards the east. Silesia, which is now part of Poland, but at this point on is loosely connected with Poland, later on even completely disconnected from Poland. I mentioned the first Polish saint. In Polish, he's called Święty Wojciech, or Adalbert in Latin. He was a Czech bishop and missionary who was sent to Prussia to convert Prussians. He was killed while doing so and canonized very quickly in only 2 years. Another saint, one of the very first saints of Poland, Saint Stanislav, canonized in 1253. He was a bishop of Poland who rebelled against the king's power and was killed. According to a legend, his body was chopped into pieces, but after a few hours, this body grew back together. This map shows you this division into principalities in 1138. And as I mentioned before, it really weakened Poland. Poland was not successful fighting Tatars or the Teutonic Knights. And Teutonic Knights, when they were invited to Poland, they settled here in this area in Mazovia. And I already told you about Tatars. This gentleman is trying to bring more information about who Tatars are and where. This is in Kraków a few years ago. By the way, Tatars, who were Polish enemy in 1200s, but then on occasion they fought with Poles against, for instance, Teutonic Knights. Some of them settled in Polish land too. And here, just to give you an idea, what was the Mongol Empire, how huge it was. Part of Russia was under Mongols. Poland was never conquered by them, but as I said, they inflicted a lot of casualties, kidnapping people and murdering and pillaging. Teutonic Knights, I mentioned they were a religious and military order. You see their name here, entire name. They colonized Prussia within 50 years. They built their state, continued to claim that Poland is really pagan, and that was justification for their wars against Poland. And these wars were conducted until 1525, when finally Poland was able to be victorious. In this map, you see Teutonic Knights state. It took them only 50 years to colonize Prussia. By the way, this Polish prince thought that they would conquer Prussia for him. And of course, he was very much mistaken. And then they colonized all of these lands, which are today's Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. You also see how they are blocking access to the Baltic Sea, access by Wisła. And that was very important for Poland because a lot of riches of Polish nobility, the source of these riches was grain trade. They grew wheat, rye, and they shipped it down Vistula River to the Baltic Sea. And from Gdańsk, this grain went to the Western Europe. Without Poland controlling Gdańsk, this trade was severely hindered. I mentioned Kraków Academy, founded by Casimir the Great. It's built in the Gothic style, and this is the courtyard of that building. And the most famous student of this school was definitely Nicholas Copernicus. This map shows you, again, these were the lands which were unified by Władysław Łokietek, Władysław the Short, and his son expanded Polish territory, especially to the east. And this shows you a trend. Then in the years to come, Poland will be expanding east. This is the tomb of Casimir the Great, buried in Wawel Cathedral. And we move on to the next chapter in Polish history, Jagiellon or Jagiellonian dynasty. Ruled Poland, as you see, for almost 200 years. And it starts with Jadwiga. After Casimir the Great died, he didn't have, as I said, a male legitimate child, I should say. And according to the agreement Casimir the Great made with his relative, King of Hungary, in case of Casimir's death, his relative Louis d'Anjou was supposed to become the ruler of Poland. Louis ruled Poland for a few years, but it was very impractical. So it was decided that his daughter will become the king of Poland, I said. And Polish nobility preferred his younger daughter, whose name was Jadwiga. She arrived in Poland. She was not even 11 years old. Very quickly, they found her a husband, and it was a Lithuanian prince, Jagiełło. Jagiełło was in his 30s. He needed to convert to Christianity, Western Christianity, in order to marry Jadwiga, and he married her in 1386. As the result, Poland and Lithuania joined, became one political entity. The last two kings of this dynasty, which ruled for about 200 years, were Sigismund I the Old and his son Sigismund Augustus, and he is the one who again died without an heir in 1572. But during the reign of these two kings, Poland was very prosperous, quite peaceful. That was the time of Renaissance in Poland, when people were very much interested in new ideas, also in Reformation in the church. A lot of Poles became Calvinists or Lutherans at that time. A lot of people studied abroad, especially in Italy. Arts were flourishing. Interest in the state, interest in politics, interest in Polish democracy, and Polish democracy really was developed then. That's why these times are referred to as the Golden Age. We already discussed Teutonic Knights and what threat they posed to Poland for many, many years, centuries really. In 1410, combined Polish-Lithuanian forces with the King Jagiełło were able to defeat the Teutonic Knights. So the Battle of Grunwald was a Polish-Lithuanian victory. However, it didn't destroy the Teutonic Knights. Still, the wars with them continued until 1525, where finally Poland defeated the order. Parts of the order's territories became vassal state of Poland, and the order was supposed to become secular. I'm going back to Sigismund Augustus, the last king of this dynasty. So toward the end of his life, it was known that the king doesn't have any offspring, and he won't have any offspring. Polish democracy was quite advanced. So Polish nobility was ready to elect their next king. But also, they were very much aware of the fact that this connection between Poland and Lithuania, it's really through the person of the king. And once this blood connection with Lithuania, embodied in the person of the king, is gone, then there is no such connection. Therefore, they needed to rethink that relationship between Poland and Lithuania. And that was done in the document which is called Union of Lublin, which was signed in 1569. According to this document, Poles and Lithuanians agreed that the country moving forward will be reigned by one king. Also, the country will have one parliament. There were still supposed to be two armies and two treasuries, for instance. According to the Union of Lublin, part of Lithuania was incorporated into Poland, and the new name of this country was the Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania. It resulted in expansion of the Polish state. I mentioned already that 1500s is the time of Renaissance and religious reformation, and a lot of interest in reforming of the church in Poland. Poland was a huge and diverse country at that time. Only 40% of people were speaking Polish or were Polish. Others were Lithuanian, there were Jews, there were Armenians, Tatars living there. There was a lot of different people. In order for these people to live peacefully, there was religious tolerance practiced in Poland. However, in 1573, Polish nobility was afraid that when they elect a king, this king might have different ideas about religion. They wanted to avoid it, and therefore they demanded the religious tolerance to be granted to them. Legislation passed by the Polish parliament. This is the tomb of Queen Jadwiga, who, by the way, is a saint. She was canonized by John Paul II. This is her tomb. The queen died in 1399. First, her little daughter, a few days old, died, and then the queen died. Her husband, Jagiełło, married 3 more times and had 3 more children. Here is Poland and Lithuania at the time when they joined. You see Poland much smaller. Here are the Teutonic Knights. Lithuania, a huge state. You have here parts of today's Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, and parts of Latvia, the 19th century representation of Battle of Grunwald. In the center of this painting, we have Prince Witold of Lithuania, and this is the master of Teutonic Knights who died in that battle. This was one of the biggest battles of the Middle Ages. And Battle of Grunwald, especially when Poland didn't have an independence, didn't exist as a country, was celebrated at this moment in Polish history when Poland was victorious over Germans. Teutonic Knights were mostly German, and in Polish history, very often there is this equation made between Germans and Teutonic Knights. So this monument was erected in Kraków. Kraków was at the time in the Austrian partition, was destroyed by the Nazi Germans and rebuilt after the Second World War. This is the part of that monument too. Here you see the fallen master of the Teutonic Knight. And anniversary celebrated in Poland. And since 1998, there is a reenactment of the battle. And reenactment of battles, it's sort of new thing to Poland, became quite popular. The outcome of this battle is, of course, known in advance. And after the battle is over, everybody drinks beer. The Jagiellonian rule in Europe, you see in this map that they were able to control a big part and influence big part of Europe, very powerful dynasty. It was also due to the fact that the youngest son of Jagiełło, Władysław, had 11 children, surviving children. There were 2 more who died in infancy. And these children, girls, were married to powerful people in the West, and male children were even ruling other countries and also became kings of Poland. So very powerful dynasty. I included this map too, although you saw similar map before. But at the time, before the Union of Lublin, so we have Grand Duchy of Lithuania and Kingdom of Poland, it is already after the Battle of Grunwald, and Poland regained the access to Gdańsk, which was so important for the grain trade. And Union of Lublin, I already told you about it. It was an attempt to create stronger ties between these 2 components, between Poland and Lithuania. The country was renamed and was supposed to have 1 monarch and 1 parliament. And that's a map after the Union of Lublin. Part of Lithuania, which is today's Ukraine, was incorporated into Poland, and that was Grand Duchy of Lithuania. You also see this Ducal Prussia, not directly incorporated into Poland, but controlled by Poland. That was this triumphant moment in Polish history when finally Teutonic Knights are forced to pay homage to the King of Poland. This is Sigismund the Old. In the middle, you see the Grand Master of Teutonic Knights, and here the King of Poland. It's all is happening in Kraków, which was capital at the time. The last 2 Jagiellons built this chapel, which is added to the Wawel Cathedral. They built it in the Renaissance style. It has a golden dome, and inside you have tombs of these 2 last rulers. The architects of the chapel and sculptors were Italian. This is a very significant Italian influence on Polish art and on Polish culture in general. And we move on to the next period. I mentioned the king didn't have an heir. Poles were ready to elect the kings, and they elected kings for over 200 years. First of all, I need to say who were people eligible to be Polish kings. First of all, they were Polish nobility, Polish gentry nobility, but not only them, also members of ruling houses of Europe. And the very first king Poland elected was Henry de Valais, came to Poland from France, but ruled only for a year because he was offered the throne of France and he decided to go back to France. Polish nobility was extremely disappointed because they thought that they bestowed this enormous honor on him, and here he just left them. The next king they elected was Stefan Batory from Hungary, who ruled for a longer time, was a very good king. But even during that period of elected kings, and as I said, the field was open. Poland tended to elect the son of the deceased father, and therefore we can talk about the Vasa dynasty, which was from Sweden, but also related to Polish previous dynasties, to Jagiellons and to Piasts. and the Saxon dynasty, German dynasty. There were also Polish-born kings. Interestingly, only 4 out of 11 elected kings were Polish. And the last king Poles elected in this period was Stanisław August Poniatowski, whom I mentioned before, was elected in 1764 with a huge support of Russia. During the time of elected kings, there was a lot of foreign influence on the elections in Poland. For instance, the Saxons were elected with a huge support of Russia. The same goes for Stanisław August Poniatowski. I mentioned Stefan Batory, which was elected after de Valais left Poland, and he was a very good king, strong king, effective king. We cannot say the same thing about subsequent kings. A lot of them, like for instance, the Vasa dynasty involved Poland in the war with Sweden, extremely destructive. These kings sometimes were overpowered by Polish nobility, and even if they had good intentions and they wanted to make some changes, modernize country, Polish nobility quite often was not interested. Especially during the reign of Saxon dynasty, we see that Polish nobility and Polish magnates, and some of them were extremely rich. They had huge estates. Some of them really didn't care if their estate is in Poland or is in a different country. So during that period, Poland was very weak. Parliament was not able to pass many legislation. It was involved in many wars with Turkey, Sweden, and Russia. In addition, in the 1600s, there were uprisings in Ukraine, uprisings of peasants and Cossacks against Polish landlords and against Jewish overseers, very bloody. Ukraine wanted to have, at that time, more autonomy, wanted to be treated as a partner of Poland and Lithuania in this Commonwealth, but Poland was not ready to grant it. This internal turmoil, the wars, destruction of the country resulted in the weakness of Poland. In addition, Poland at the time was ruled in a very parliamentary fashion, with parliament deciding on taxes, wars, and all of the business of the state. And it was not the case with the surrounding countries. Surrounding countries were ruled in more authoritarian style. In addition, they invested heavily in the military. Plus, they wanted to expand their territories. So in this situation, it's not a surprise that they decided to partition Poland. The first partition happened in 1772 when Russia, Prussia, and Austria annexed parts of Poland. Then in 1793, they annexed more. 1795, the final third partition came, and Poland disappeared from the map of Europe for 123 years. But there were attempts to save the country, and one of these attempts was creating a constitution of May 3rd, which was supposed to change a lot of things in Poland, to modernize Poland. Also, the military Kościuszko uprising, you see it is shortly before the final partition. Kościuszko, who already fought in the American Revolution, he tried to mobilize Polish peasants to fight for Polish independence. At the very beginning, they were successful, but then the uprising ended in the defeat. I told you a little bit about Stefan Batory, successful in wars against Russia. In this painting, we see these very interesting Polish knights, cavalrymen, hussars. That was the most famous Polish military force, very effective in the battlefield, and they had these wings. The capital was moved to Warsaw in 1596, as Warsaw was located more centrally than Krakow. Also, for the king, who was from a Swedish dynasty, it was closer to Sweden. King Jan III Sobieski was the commander of European armies during the Battle of Vienna in 1683, where he stopped the advancement of the Ottoman Empire, or Turkey, which started advancing towards Western Europe in 1453 when they conquered Constantinople. And here he is again in the 19th century paintings. It was the last great military victory of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Among the loot which Jan Sobieski brought from that campaign were Turkish tents. And if you are lucky, if you are in Krakow, from time to time, they are shown at the Wawel Castle. They're extremely precious, therefore you cannot see them every day, but sometimes they are exhibited. I mentioned to you the Saxon kings. There's two Saxon kings, father and the son. They ruled for quite a long time. They spent most of their times in Germany, not in Poland. However, the majority of Polish nobility really liked it. They thought that it's good to have a weak king. It's good to have a king who doesn't influence anything. So they enjoyed those times. And we still have the saying in Polish, under the Saxon king, eat, drink, and loosen your belt. We usually use this expression when somebody behaves in a very irresponsible way, because that's what Polish nobility did at that time. They enjoyed that, what they called golden freedom, but the end of Poland was on the horizon. And the last king Poland elected in 1764 with a strong support of Russia was Stanisław August Poniatowski. He was the king who really tried to modernize Poland, initiated lots of progressive reforms. However, it was too late. Among them was the Constitution of May 3rd, 1791. But as I said, that was all too late. And Poland was partitioned by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. The king was forced to abdicate in 1795. I mentioned the Kościuszko uprising, which took place 1794. There was an attempt to push the Russian out of Poland and save Poland, was unsuccessful. Most of the partitioned Polish lands went to Russia, and you see them here, and some to Prussia, and some to Austria. So it should come as no surprise that the biggest national military uprisings were against Russia. The two of them were the November uprising of 1830 and the January uprising of 1863. They both ended in defeat. A lot of people died either in the battlefield or later on executed. Thousands of Poles were punished by being sent to, or rather marched to Siberia. Some of them returned from this exile after 15 or 20 years. Sometimes wives followed the husbands. The people's estates were confiscated by the Russians. A lot of people who took part in this uprising tried to avoid being prosecuted, and they left Poland. A lot of them went to France, and France became Polish political and cultural center. The uprising of 1830 captured imagination of many people in the West, and especially the uprising was popular in France. During the time when Poland didn't exist, Poland was quite often portrayed as a captive woman, like you see in this drawing. Another drawing from the same series shows Poles getting ready for a battle. You see the unity of them. This kind of art hope to keep Polish spirits up, to keep the thought about regaining independence alive, and were very successful. Where are Poles now? They had this turbulent history, exciting history. In 2009, in the fall of 2009, Polityka, which is very influential weekly, published an article entitled A Cracked Self-Portrait. This is a drawing which came with the article. So we have a lot of different artifacts, and what do they symbolize? Going from the left, we have this hussar's wings with the date 1683. This is, as I said, Polish military victory. Then we have Lech Wałęsa, Solidarity and agreements of 1980. He signed these agreements with that huge sort of kitschy pen. Then we have a head and mustache of Józef Piłsudski, a father of the Second Republic of Poland, which was established in 1918. Then we have a cross and the date 966. This is the year where Poland adopted Christianity. The same date points to two things: Christianity, cross, and Polish flag. So Christianity and statehood were very much connected throughout Polish history. Then we have a saber, which is here, and it's a traditional weapon of Polish gentry. And we have a scythe, and the date 1794. I told you about the Kościuszko uprising against Russians. He was able to mobilize peasants, and that was a weapon which peasants used. And these two dates represent Polish love for soccer. There are additional wounds. Some of them represent partitions of Poland and these two national uprisings against Russia, which I mentioned to you. We see that this Pole, he shows off these wounds proudly. It symbolizes Polish pride of the history, but at the same time, Poles as victims of this history. Another drawing, which was in the same article, shows another part of that Polish identity, which is Poles perceiving themselves as victims of two totalitarian systems, German Nazi and Soviet communism. So we have a Pole and these two totalitarian systems on the top of him. However, as Poland became more prosperous as a member of the European Union and more integrated with the Union, this narrative of victimhood was fading away and was replaced more with being proud of history, but not focusing so much on being a victim in different parts of history. So how do Poles see themselves now? When PiS, the party Law and Justice, came back into power in 2015, by the way, they were re-elected last year for another 4 years. Jarosław Kaczyński, who was the party leader, he developed that new narrative for Poland, how the EU is really an enemy of Poland and Poland is a victim of the EU and Poland needs to get up off its knees, stop being subservient to the EU. Polish history is reflected in Polish banknotes, which you can see here. This is the end of my presentation. I didn't talk about Poland during the Second World War. I didn't talk about Poland under communism, as we'll be covering these topics separately. Dziękuję bardzo. Thank you.